33 years ago, a billionaire with a pointer and a stack of charts stood on a debate stage and told America exactly what was coming. He said if the country signed one trade deal, there would be a giant sucking sound. The sound of American jobs leaving the country and heading south to Mexico. He said it plainly on live television, in front of the sitting president and the man about to become president. And most of the political establishment laughed. Nearly 20 million Americans did not laugh. In 1992, this man won almost 19% of the vote for president while belonging to no party at all. It was the strongest showing by an outsider candidate in 80 years. And then he lost. The deal passed anyway, and within a decade, the towns he was talking about started going quiet, one factory at a time. So here is the question. If he was right, why did the country bury the message along with the man? This is the story of Ross Perot, the warning he gave in 1992, and the 33 years America spent arguing about whether he was a prophet or a crank. And it starts with a Texas billionaire who decided the two most powerful parties in the world were both lying to the same people. To understand why nearly 20 million Americans voted for a man with no party, you have to understand what they were afraid of. In the early 1990s, American manufacturing is still enormous. Roughly 17.5 million people go to work every day making things. Steel in Pennsylvania, cars and parts across the industrial Midwest, furniture in the Carolinas, televisions and appliances in towns whose entire tax base rests on a single plant. For 2 generations, that plant was the deal. You graduated high school, you walked in the gate, and you got a wage that could raise a family, buy a house, and retire with a pension. No college required. But underneath that surface, something is shifting. The Cold War is ending. Capital is becoming global. And the men who run large companies are looking at a map and doing arithmetic that terrifies the men who work for them. A worker in an American plant might cost $15, $16, $17 an hour once you count benefits. A worker across the border in Mexico might cost about $1 an hour. Same task, same product. A fraction of the cost. Into this moment steps a proposed agreement called the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. On paper, it is elegant. Knock down the tariffs and trade barriers between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and create the largest free trade zone on Earth. Both parties in Washington support it. President George H.W. Bush negotiates it. His challenger, Bill Clinton, will sign it. The experts agree. The editorial boards agree. The consensus is total. And that near-total agreement is exactly what makes one man suspicious. Because if the deal is so obviously good for everyone, why does it feel like nobody asked the people who actually work in the factories? That question is about to be asked loudly by the last person Washington expected to challenge them. And the strange thing is, he was not supposed to be in the race at all. Ross Perot did not look like a man who would frighten 2 political parties at once. He was small, plain-spoken, with jug ears and a flat East Texas twang. He looked like an accountant who had wandered onto the wrong stage, but the story underneath was extraordinary. Perot had started as a salesman at IBM, and by his own account, he blew through his entire annual sales quota in the first few weeks of 1 year. He left, and in 1962 he founded a company called Electronic Data Systems, EDS, with $1,000. He built it into a data processing giant and became, in the process, one of the richest men in America. He was not just wealthy, he had a reputation for doing the thing other people only talked about. When 2 of his EDS employees were imprisoned in Iran during the 1979 revolution, Perot personally financed and organized a private rescue mission, led by a retired Green Beret colonel to get them out. The story became a best-selling book. This was a man who did not wait for institutions to solve problems. He solved them and sent the bill afterward. By 1992, Perot had turned that same impatience toward the federal government. He looked at 2 things and could not let them go. The first was the national debt, which he considered a slow-motion betrayal of the next generation. The second was trade, and the growing sense that Washington was about to sign away the industrial base of the country to save corporations a few dollars an hour in labor. In February of 1992, he went on Larry King's
television show and did something no serious billionaire had done.
He said that if ordinary volunteers got him on the ballot in all 50 states, he would run for president. It was meant to sound almost casual. It detonated. Volunteers mobilized in every state. Within months, some polls showed Perot leading both President Bush and Governor Clinton. An independent, with no party, no machine, and no experience, was in first place for the presidency of the United States. Perot ran his campaign like no one before him. Instead of 30-second attack ads, he bought 30-minute blocks of primetime television and used them to give economics lectures. He stood there with a pointer and a stack of hand-drawn charts, walking Americans through deficits, debt, and trade like a folksy schoolteacher. The pundits mocked the charts. Tens of millions of people watched them anyway. He was funding the entire operation out of his own pocket, eventually spending tens of millions of his own dollars, which meant there was no donor, no lobby, and no party he owed anything to. And then, at the peak of it, he did something that should have ended him. In July of 1992, Ross Perot abruptly quit the race. He gave a strange explanation, later claiming Republican operatives had been plotting to disrupt his daughter's wedding and smear her with a fake photograph. To most observers, it sounded like paranoia. His stunned volunteers felt betrayed. His support collapsed. It looked like the end, except it wasn't. In October, with the election weeks away, Ross Perot climbed back into the race. And what he was about to say in a single sentence on a debate stage would outlive his campaign, his reputation, and the man himself. October 15th, 1992, Richmond, Virginia. 3 men on a stage, the sitting president, the challenger, and the billionaire who had quit and come back. The topic turns to the trade agreement, and Perot leans into it. He says that the moment NAFTA passes, American companies will look at paying a worker here versus paying a worker in Mexico $1 an hour, and the decision will make itself. He says you will hear a giant sucking sound of jobs being pulled out of the country and down across the southern border. He argues that no American factory can compete with a wage that low, and that the deal does not lift Mexican wages up so much as it drags American jobs down. It is vivid. It is memorable. It is the kind of line that survives when everything else about a debate is forgotten, and it is immediately dismissed by almost everyone who matters. Economists call it simplistic. The administration calls it fear-mongering. The consensus holds that free trade grows the whole pie, that cheaper goods help every consumer, and that the losers, if there are any, will be small and easily retrained. Perot also published a book that year with a blunt title, Save Your Job, Save Our Country. Why NAFTA Must Be Stopped. The message did not change. The establishment's response did not change either. In November, the votes come in. Bill Clinton wins the presidency, but Ross Perot pulls 19,741,065 votes. Nearly 19% of everyone who voted. He does not win a single electoral vote, not one, because his support is spread evenly across the whole country instead of concentrated. But no independent had reached numbers like this since 1912. A man with no party had just convinced 1 in 5 American voters that Washington was not telling them the truth about their own economy. And here is where it should get simple. The prophet loses the election, the deal gets stopped, and history proves him right. That is not what happens. Because the deal does not get stopped. Clinton, a Democrat, picks up the Republican negotiated agreement and pushes it through. To sell it, the administration promises the opposite of what Perot predicted. It says NAFTA will create around 200,000 American jobs by 1995 alone. Prosperity, not a sucking sound. To finish Perot off in the public mind, the administration sends Vice President Al Gore to debate him directly on live television in November of 1993. It is one of the highest-rated cable programs of its time, and Gore is prepared, poised, and relentless. He needles Perot, corners him on specifics, and gets him flustered on national television. The polling afterward is brutal for Perot. The consensus declares the debate a knockout. NAFTA takes effect on January 1st, 1994. The sucking sound, everyone agrees, was a punchline. Now watch what actually happens over the next 20 years. The trade relationship with Mexico inverts. Before the deal, the United States runs a rough balance, even a small surplus, in goods with Mexico. Within a few years, it slips into deficit, and that deficit keeps widening decade after decade until by recent years, it reaches into the range of nearly $200 billion annually. Factories do move south. Auto parts plants, appliance makers, textile mills. The exact industries Perot pointed at start relocating for exactly the reason he named. And the towns feel it before the economists admit it. Places built around a single plant watch that plant announce a move. Then the supplier who fed the plant closes. Then the diner across the street. This is the pattern that will hollow out stretches of the industrial Midwest and the Southeast over the following 2 decades. The jobs that vanish do not come back, and the wages that replace them, if any, are lower. For the people living it, the giant sucking sound is not a metaphor. It is a foreclosure notice. But here is the part that is harder to say than, he was right. The full truth is messier than the prophecy, and it is messier in a way that matters. When serious economists went back and tried to measure NAFTA's specific effect, the numbers were real, but smaller than the legend. The Economic Policy Institute, no friend of these deals, estimated the jobs specifically displaced to Mexico by NAFTA in the hundreds of thousands. Around 680,000 net jobs, not millions. The figure people love to quote, 4.7 million manufacturing jobs lost, describes the total collapse of American manufacturing employment over a much longer stretch. And most of that damage has a different primary cause. That cause has a name, and it is not Mexico. It is China. When China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, the shock to American manufacturing was far larger than anything NAFTA did. Economists later called it the China shock, and it accounts for a huge share of the factory jobs that disappeared. On top of that came automation. Robots and software did to the factory floor what they did to the farm, producing more with far fewer people. So the honest verdict is this: Perot named the wrong villain and the right disease. He said Mexico, and the bigger wound came from China and from machines. But the thing he actually understood, the thing the entire Washington consensus refused to say out loud, was correct. He understood that when you let capital chase the lowest wage on earth, the pain does not spread out gently across the whole economy the way the models promised. It concentrates, it falls on specific people, in specific towns, doing specific jobs, and it falls all at once. The experts were measuring the national average. Perot was talking to the town that was about to lose everything. Both can be true. Only one of them shows up at your kitchen table, and that is why the message outlived the man. Ross Perot ran again in 1996 and faded. His movement fractured. His running mate from '92, a decorated war hero and prisoner of war named Admiral James Stockdale, had been mocked mercilessly after opening a debate by asking out loud, "Who am I? Why am I here?" The eccentricity, the abrupt dropout, the conspiracy talk, all of it made Perot easy to file away as a strange footnote. He went back to business. He died in July of 2019. But the sentence did not die. 2 decades after Richmond, the exact grievance Perot named, forgotten factory towns, jobs pulled overseas, an establishment that would not listen, became one of the most powerful forces in American politics. In 2016, a different billionaire ran for president promising to tear up the trade deals and bring the jobs home. And he carried the very Rust Belt states that had lived Perot's prophecy. NAFTA itself was renegotiated and replaced in 2020 with a new agreement, the USMCA, built partly around the complaints Perot had raised in 1992. Here is what I find genuinely striking about this whole story. In 1992, the smartest people in both parties agreed on the same thing, and they were confident, and they were credentialed. And on the narrow national numbers, they were even mostly correct. And they still completely missed what was about to happen to a specific slice of the country, because the men and women in those factories were an average to them, not a face. The one guy in the room, without a party, without a filter, and without anything to lose, said the uncomfortable thing plainly, and the establishment's response was not to argue the substance. It was to make him a joke. His other warning went the same way. Perot spent 1992 waving charts about the national debt and telling Americans they were mortgaging their grandchildren. He was called a scold. In October of 2025, the national debt of the United States crossed $38 trillion. Nobody is laughing at that chart anymore either. We did not lose Ross Perot because he was wrong. We lost the willingness to hear a warning just because of who was delivering it, and how strange he seemed, and how much easier it was to argue with the messenger than with the message. He was imprecise about the cause. He was early, he was odd, and on the fundamental thing, that Washington was about to make a decision whose costs would land on people it had stopped listening to, he was closer to right than almost anyone with a podium that year. 33 years later, drive through one of those towns, stand where the plant used to be, aren't used. Some of it is parking now. Some of it is a distribution warehouse for goods made 3,000 miles away. Listen for the shift whistle that used to run 3 times a day. It isn't there. The sound Perot warned about was the sound of it leaving. If you ever worked in one of those plants, or grew up in one of those towns, or had a father who did, drop a comment and tell me which factory, which town, which year the work left. If this story made you look at that debate stage a little differently, hit subscribe. We are building an archive of the moments America argued about and then chose to forget, and the people who lived through this deserve to have it remembered accurately. Like helps the next person find it. I'll see you on the next one.